How is an empire born? Not with a handshake, but with a blow. A single, decisive strike from a mace that crushes a skull and shatters an entire way of life. For thousands of years before the first pharaoh, the Nile Valley was a tapestry of warring tribes, a chaotic dance of ambition and bloodshed fought in the reed-choked marshes. It was a world of petty chieftains, each carving out a fleeting domain, their names and deeds swallowed by the silt of the great river. But from this primordial violence, a new and terrifying idea was about to emerge, that one man could and should rule all. The evidence for this brutal birth is not written in a book, but carved into a slab of green siltstone, the Narmer palette. It is the founding document of the world's first nation-state, and it is a testament to slaughter. On one side, we see the king, Narmer, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, his arm raised, mace in hand, ready to execute a kneeling captive. Beneath his feet lie the bodies of his enemies. On the other side, wearing the red crown of the conquered Lower Egypt, he inspects rows of decapitated foes, their heads neatly tucked between their legs. This is not a metaphor. Archaeologists at Hierakonpolis, the ancient seat of power, have unearthed evidence of mass graves dating to this exact period, graves filled with the young men who likely fought against this unification. This was the price of order. The first pharaoh did not persuade his rivals, he annihilated them. The palette hides a chilling statistic, the tens of thousands of lives that became the bloody mortar for the world's first unified state. This was more than just conquest, it was the birth of a political theology. Narmer is depicted not merely as a man, but as a divine force, the living embodiment of the falcon god Horus, a predator swooping down to impose his will upon the chaos of humanity. Every smiting of an enemy was a ritual act, a reenactment of the cosmic victory of order over chaos. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was the linchpin of creation, the sole intermediary between the gods and humanity. Without him, the sun would not rise, the Nile would not flood, and the world would plunge back into the darkness from which he had dragged it. This was the grand bargain offered to the people of the Nile Valley. Submit to one man's absolute authority, and in return, you will receive stability, predictability, the very rhythm of the universe guaranteed. It was an offer they could not refuse, for the alternative was the executioner's mace and the unmarked grave. The very concept of Egypt was forged in this crucible of terror and faith. He was the state, the law, and the living God. A power so absolute had never existed before. The question it raises is one that has haunted humanity ever since. Is civilization impossible without a foundation of overwhelming sanctified violence? The early rulers cemented this power with ruthless efficiency. They established a capital, Memphis, strategically placed at the junction of the two conquered lands, a symbol of their unified control. From here, a bureaucracy began to extend its tendrils, counting every head of cattle, every bushel of grain, every man eligible for labor or war. This was not just administration, it was the instrumentation of total ownership. The pharaoh owned Egypt. He owned its land, its resources, and its people. They were assets to be deployed as he saw fit. The early dynastic tombs at Abydos reveal a horrifying practice, retainer sacrifice. When a king died, his courtiers, his servants, even his animals were killed and buried with him to serve him in the afterlife. Dozens of skeletons surround the tombs of the first kings, a silent testament to the belief that their lives were utterly disposable, their existence meaningful only in relation to the divine ruler. This was not murder in their eyes, it was a cosmic necessity, ensuring the pharaoh's comfort and status in the eternal realm. These first dynasties were laying down the psychological framework of a nation. Your life is not your own, it belongs to the God-King. This brutal consolidation took generations. Wars continued on the frontiers, rebellions were crushed with merciless force, and the ideology of divine kingship was hammered into the consciousness of the people through art, ritual, and terror. Every depiction of the pharaoh showed him larger than life, effortlessly defeating Egypt's enemies, who were always portrayed as chaotic, subhuman figures. This was the world's first and most successful propaganda machine, and its message was simple. We are order, they are chaos. We are divine, they are profane. There could be no negotiation, only subjugation. The pharaoh was the shepherd of his people, but he ruled with an iron crook. He protected them from outside threats, but he demanded absolute obedience in return. The cost of this security was freedom, a concept that likely did not even exist in the Egyptian vocabulary. They had traded the unpredictable violence of warring chieftains for the systematic, inescapable power of a single, divine ruler. But how do you sustain such a myth? How do you make the idea of a living God tangible, undeniable, permanent? A powerful army and a secret police can control the living, but the pharaohs were playing a much longer game. Their obsession was not with life, but with eternity. To truly be a god, the king's power had to transcend death itself. This required more than just a burial pit and a few sacrificed servants. It required a statement, a monument so vast, so audacious, that it would physically alter the landscape and proclaim his divinity for all time. The early mastaba tombs, flat-topped mud brick structures, were impressive for their time, but they were fundamentally earthbound. They spoke of the grave, of the underworld. A true god needed something more. He needed a ladder to the stars, a machine for resurrection, a permanent fixture in the cosmic order. A king had unified the land with blood and iron, but to truly command its soul, an idea was needed. An idea that could subjugate millions not just for a lifetime, but for millennia. An idea that could be embodied in stone. So, who are you siding with in this brutal dawn of civilization? Do you stand with the visionary but ruthless king who forged a nation from chaos, or with the rebels who fought for their freedom but promised only continued strife? Let us know in the comments which path you believe was necessary. The idea, when it came, was not born in the mind of a king, but in that of his most trusted servant. For centuries, the pharaohs had been buried beneath mounds of mud brick, grander than any commoner's grave, but still tethered to the earth. They were horizontal, monuments to rest. But the pharaoh Djoser of the Third Dynasty had a vizier of unparalleled genius, a man named Imhotep. He was a physician, an astronomer, a priest, and an administrator. But above all, he was an architect with an imagination that bordered on the divine. It was Imhotep who looked at the traditional mastaba tomb and saw not an end, but a beginning. He proposed to his king something that had never been conceived of, let alone attempted. He would not just build a tomb, he would build a stairway to the heavens. He would take the humble mud brick mastaba, replicate it in a more permanent material, and then stack them one on top of the other, each smaller than the last, creating a towering stepped structure that would forever sever the connection with the earth and point defiantly towards the sky. He would build with stone. This was not a simple evolution in design, it was a revolution that would change the world forever. Before Imhotep, large-scale construction was done with perishable materials, wood, mud brick, reeds. Stone was used sparingly for lintels or thresholds. To build an entire mountain of quarried limestone was a logistical and engineering feat of staggering proportions. It required a level of social and economic organization that had never before been mobilized. First, the stone had to be found and extracted, quarries were opened, and armies of laborers were sent to cut massive blocks from the living rock using nothing more than copper chisels and wooden wedges. Then, these multi-ton blocks had to be transported, sometimes for miles, from the quarry to the construction site at Saqqara. This required the construction of ramps, the use of sledges, and the brute force of thousands of men, their muscles straining under the desert sun. The project was a gargantuan consumer of resources. It demanded a nationwide effort, a centralization of power so complete that a single man's vision could command the labor of an entire generation. What would you feel standing at the foot of a monument built not just with stone, but with the sweat and sacrifice of 100,000 people? The Step Pyramid of Djoser was not merely a tomb, it was a microcosm of the Egyptian state and a declaration of its power. Surrounding the pyramid was a vast complex of stone buildings, a miniature eternal palace for the king's spirit, or Ka. There were dummy temples, courtyards for ritual races, and chapels, all enclosed within a massive wall over 10 meters high. Most astonishingly, the entire complex was a replica of the perishable structures of the real world, but rendered in eternal stone. It was a political manifesto. It said that the power of the pharaoh was not temporary, it was as permanent as the rock from which his palace was hewn. The project took decades to complete. It was the Manhattan Project of its day, drawing in the best minds and the strongest backs from across the kingdom. Imhotep himself oversaw every detail, inventing new construction techniques, solving unforeseen problems, and driving the project forward with relentless determination. In doing so, he transformed not only architecture but also the very nature of the state. The Pyramid Project created the bureaucracy, the supply chains, and the management structures that would define Egypt for the next 3,000 years. The human cost of this architectural leap was immense. While the pyramid builders were not slaves in the modern sense, they were conscripted laborers, often farmers working during the Nile's inundation when their fields were flooded. Their lives were hard and short. Archaeological evidence from workers' cemeteries shows a population plagued by industrial accidents, crushed limbs, fractured skulls, and spines worn down by years of hauling heavy loads. They were fed, housed, and cared for, but they were ultimately cogs in a colossal machine, their individual lives sublimated to the pharaoh's quest for immortality. This was the dark side of the stone revolution. For one man to live forever, thousands had to toil in grueling, dangerous conditions. Yet, it created a shared national purpose. To work on the pyramid was to serve the god-king, to contribute to the stability of the cosmos. It was a form of worship expressed through labor. A man who builds a stairway for a god, and in doing so becomes a god himself, leaves an indelible mark on history. Imhotep's achievement was so profound that centuries after his death he was deified, worshipped as a god of medicine and wisdom. He was the first commoner in history to break the ultimate barrier and achieve immortality, not through birth, but through sheer genius. The step pyramid was a game-changer. It set a new standard for royal burials and, more importantly, for royal ambition. It was a tangible demonstration of the pharaoh's power to command nature, to organize society on an unprecedented scale, and to build for eternity. Once Djoser had shown the way, there was no going back. The pharaohs who followed him were now locked in a cycle of one-upmanship, each compelled to build something grander, more complex, and more impressive than his predecessor. The bar had been raised to the heavens, and the subsequent rulers of the Old Kingdom would spend the next century in a frantic, obsessive quest to perfect this new architectural form. They experimented with designs like the failed Maiden Pyramid and the bent Pyramid of Sneferu, which changed angles halfway up. These were not just architectural missteps, they were hugely expensive failures, each representing a massive investment of national resources. But they were necessary steps in the learning process. These early pyramid builders were writing the textbook of stone construction through trial and error. This relentless ambition, this divine obsession, would culminate in the ultimate expression of pharaonic power on the Giza Plateau. The age of the pyramids was just beginning, and the next generation of kings, the Sun Kings, were about to create monuments so perfect they would be considered wonders of the world. The pharaoh Sneferu, father of Khufu, was the greatest pyramid builder in Egyptian history. He was not content with one monument. He built three, culminating in the first true, smooth-sided pyramid, the Red Pyramid at Dashur. In the process, he quarried more stone than any other pharaoh, perfecting the techniques that would be used at Giza. When his son, Khufu, ascended the throne, the mission was clear: to build the single greatest, most perfect structure on the face of the earth. The Great Pyramid of Giza was the result. For over 3,800 years, it would remain the tallest man-made structure in the world. It is a monument of terrifying precision. Its base is leveled to within a fraction of an inch, and its sides are aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal points. It was constructed from an estimated 2.3 million blocks of stone, some weighing as much as 80 tons. It was a project so vast, It is difficult to comprehend even today. It transformed Egypt into a single, massive construction site, a theocratic command economy focused on one goal, ensuring the king's successful journey into the afterlife. This was the apex of the pharaoh's power. He was no longer just the incarnation of Horus, he was now the son of the sun god Ra, a sun king whose eternal destiny was to join his father in his daily journey across the sky. The pyramid was his launchpad, his resurrection machine. The sheer scale of the Giza projects, Khufu's Great Pyramid, Khafra's slightly smaller pyramid, and his Sphinx, and Menkaura's more modest monument, placed an almost unbearable strain on the Egyptian state. An entire city was built near the pyramids to house the tens of thousands of skilled workers and laborers. A complex logistical network was established to bring in food, tools, and raw materials from all over the kingdom and beyond. Granite from Aswan, hundreds of miles to the south, copper from the Sinai Peninsula, fine white limestone from Tura across the Nile. The pharaoh's will drove this machine, but the engine that powered it was the burgeoning priesthood of Ra, based at Heliopolis. As the pharaohs increasingly associated themselves with the sun god, the priests of Ra grew immensely wealthy and powerful. They controlled vast estates, managed enormous temples, and held key administrative posts. They were the ideological guardians of the divine kingship, the ones who provided the theological justification for the pyramid-building enterprise. But their power was a double-edged sword. While they supported the pharaoh, they also became a rival center of authority, a state within the state. A dangerous imbalance was developing. The king was building for his own eternity, but the priests were accumulating power in the here and now. The bigger the monument to eternity, the faster the kingdom that built it can crumble. This era of divine grandeur was also an age of absolute paranoia. The Fourth Dynasty was plagued by internal strife and succession crises. The stakes were impossibly high, the throne was the ultimate prize, and competition for it was fierce. Whispers of conspiracies filled the corridors of the royal palace. Princes plotted against their brothers. Queens maneuvered to place their own sons in power. We have hints of this in later texts, legends of sibling rivalries and murdered heirs. Khufu himself seems to have had a reputation for cruelty, a ruler who, according to the later Greek historian Herodotus, closed the temples and forced his people into slave labor to build his monument. While this is likely an exaggeration, it reflects a kernel of truth. The construction of the Great Pyramid must have been an oppressive experience for the common people, a project that consumed their labor and their resources for a generation. Absolute power had created a system that was outwardly invincible but inwardly brittle. The pharaoh was a god, but he was also a man who could be betrayed, poisoned, and overthrown by those closest to him. So, how did it all fall apart? How did this seemingly unshakable kingdom of god-kings capable of building mountains of stone collapse into a century of chaos known as the First Intermediate Period? There was no single cause, but rather a perfect storm of calamities. Decades of pyramid building had severely depleted the royal treasury. The pharaohs had been granting tax-exempt status to the temples and mortuary cults of their predecessors, gradually eroding the state's economic base. The growing power of provincial governors or nomarchs allowed them to rule their districts with increasing autonomy, challenging the centralized authority of the king. Then came the catalyst, climate change. Evidence from Nile flood records and sediment cores indicates a prolonged period of catastrophic drought at the end of the Old Kingdom. The life-giving inundation failed year after year. Famine stalked the land. Texts from the period, like the admonitions of Ipuwer, paint a horrifying picture of social collapse. The rich became poor, the poor rose up, and society was turned upside down. The river is blood, one text laments, a grim description of civil war and anarchy. The divine pharaoh, whose primary role was to guarantee the cosmic order, had failed. His inability to make the Nile flood shattered the ideological foundation of his rule. If the king was no longer the guarantor of Ma'at, the divine order, then what was the point of his authority? The state disintegrated. Nomarchs declared themselves independent rulers. Civil war erupted between rival claimants to the throne. Gangs of starving peasants roamed the countryside, and for the first time, even the sacred pyramids were looted. The Old Kingdom, the age of the god-builders, ended not with a bang, but with a desperate, hungry whimper. It was a traumatic collapse that would scar the Egyptian psyche for centuries. It proved that even a civilization that builds for eternity can be brought to its knees by a failing harvest and a loss of faith. It would take generations of brutal warfare to piece the kingdom back together. But the memory of this failure would linger, a constant reminder of the fragility of power. And centuries later, another pharaoh would rise, one who believed that the problem wasn't a lack of faith, but the wrong kind of faith. A pharaoh who would not just challenge the gods, but declare war on them. A true heretic was waiting in the wings of history. For nearly 1,500 years, the Egyptian pantheon had been a stable, sprawling family of gods. At its head stood Amun-Ra, a syncretic deity combining the creative power of the sun god Ra with the mysterious hidden force of the Theban god Amun. His priesthood, based in the temple complex of Karnak at Thebes, had become the most powerful institution in the land. They owned a third of Egypt's fertile land, controlled vast treasuries, and wielded immense political influence. They were the kingmakers, the power behind the throne. Any pharaoh who wished to rule effectively had to do so with their blessing, until one man decided he would rather rule without them. His name was Amenhotep IV. He ascended the throne as a conventional pharaoh, but within a few years he unleashed a religious revolution so radical, so utterly shocking, that it would tear Egypt apart. He was history's first great iconoclast, a monotheist born into a world of 1,000 gods. What could drive a man to declare war on the traditions of his ancestors and the faith of his people? The revolution began subtly. Amenhotep started by promoting a minor aspect of the sun god, the Aten, represented not as a human or animal figure, but as a simple solar disk whose rays ended in hands, extending the gift of life to the royal family. But this was just the beginning. In the 5th year of his reign, he made his move. He changed his own name from Amenhotep, which meant Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. He then abandoned Thebes, the heart of the Amun cult, and began construction of an entirely new capital city in the middle of the desert, a place now known as Amarna. He called it Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. This was a declaration of war. He was physically and spiritually severing himself from the corrupting influence of the old priesthood. At Akhenaten, he and his beautiful queen, Nefertiti, would be the sole high priests of a new, singular god. The Aten was declared the one true creator, the universal god, not just of Egypt, but of all humanity. All other gods were declared false. This was an idea so alien to the ancient mindset that it was almost incomprehensible. It was a spiritual act of total annihilation. The war against the old gods was waged with ruthless fanaticism. Akhenaten dispatched his agents throughout Egypt with a chilling mission to erase the names of the plural gods wherever they were found. Most of all, the name of his great rival, Amun, was to be systematically chiseled out of every temple wall, every obelisk, every statue in the land. Imagine the scene, stonecutters hanging precariously from the great pylons of Karnak, their hammers and chisels ringing out as they methodically destroyed the sacred names that had been revered for centuries. It was an act of profound sacrilege, a state-sponsored campaign of vandalism that struck at the very heart of Egyptian identity. The vast revenues of the Amun temples were confiscated and diverted to the construction of Akhenaten. The old religious festivals were cancelled. The entire religious economy that had sustained thousands of priests, artisans and workers collapsed. Akhenaten had not just proposed a new god, he had launched a totalitarian purge of the old ones. A man who declared war on 1,000 gods soon found his greatest enemy in the hearts of his own people. Life in the new city of Akhenaten was a strange paradox. The art of the Amarna period broke with millennia of rigid, idealized tradition. For the first time, the pharaoh was depicted not as an invincible, muscular hero, but as a strange, almost alien figure with an elongated skull, slender limbs, and a sagging belly. We see intimate, shockingly realistic scenes of the royal family, Akhenaten kissing his daughter, Nefertiti dandling a child on her knee. It was a cult of personality centered on the pharaoh and his family as the sole conduits to the divine. Only through Akhenaten could humanity know the Aten. He was no longer just a king, he was a prophet. But this artistic freedom hid a deeply authoritarian reality. The new religion was exclusive and intolerant. While the old pantheon had room for countless local deities, the cult of the Aten had no room for anything but itself. For the common Egyptian, this was a disaster. Their personal gods, the protectors of their homes and families like Bes and Taweret, were now outlawed. Their access to the afterlife, once guaranteed by Osiris, was now uncertain. The revolution that promised a universal god had, in practice, alienated almost everyone. While Akhenaten was composing beautiful hymns to the Aten and redesigning his kingdom's soul, the world outside was in turmoil. The Egyptian empire in the Near East, forged by his warrior predecessors, was beginning to crumble. Vassal kings sent desperate letters found centuries later in the Amarna archives, begging for troops and aid against rising powers like the Hittites. Akhenaten, seemingly lost in his spiritual reverie, ignored their pleas. His religious obsession had made him a catastrophic statesman. The military grew restless, the bureaucracy was in chaos, and the common people, stripped of their traditional beliefs and suffering from economic disruption, began to seethe with resentment. Was Akhenaten a visionary mystic, a prophet ahead of his time? Or was he a dangerous madman, a tyrant who imposed his personal obsession on an unwilling nation, leading it to the brink of collapse? His revolution was a brilliant, blinding flash, but it was destined to burn out, leaving behind a darkness filled with whispers of revenge and restoration. Akhenaten's radical experiment was a profound challenge to the very soul of Egypt. It raises a question we still grapple with today. Was he a forward-thinking revolutionary trying to free his people from a corrupt and superstitious priesthood, or was he a fanatic whose obsession destroyed the stability and traditions of his nation? Your choice in the comments reveals what you value more, progress or order. The end of Akhenaten's reign is shrouded in mystery. He simply disappears from the historical record. Was he assassinated by his enemies in the military or the old priesthood? Did he die of a plague that swept through his utopian city? We do not know. What we do know is that his death left a power vacuum and a nation on the verge of civil war. The Amarna experiment had failed catastrophically. The empire was shrinking, the economy was in shambles, and the people were desperate for a return to the old ways. In the chaotic aftermath, a shadowy figure named Smenkhkare briefly ruled, perhaps a brother or son of Akhenaten, before also vanishing. The stage was now set for the ultimate act of counter-revolution, and at its center was a child. A 9-year-old boy born Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, ascended the throne. He was likely Akhenaten's son, a living relic of the hated heresy. He was young, impressionable, and utterly alone, a perfect pawn for the powerful men who now circled the throne like vultures. The true rulers of Egypt during this period were not the boy king, but two cunning and ambitious officials, the elderly vizier, a long-serving courtier who had seen it all, and the commander of the armies, General Horemheb, a brilliant military man with a deep-seated contempt for Akhenaten's failed policies. Together they orchestrated the restoration. They understood that to save Egypt, the Amarna heresy had to be not just abandoned, but obliterated. The first step was to move the court away from the cursed city of Akhenaten and back to the traditional capitals of Memphis and Thebes. The next was a public act of renunciation. The young king's name was changed from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. It was a declaration to the entire world. The old gods were back. A decree was issued, the Restoration Stela, which described the preceding era as a time when the temples of the gods and goddesses had gone to pieces. The land was in distress. The gods had forsaken this land. It was a masterful piece of propaganda, blaming the nation's ills on the dead heretic and positioning the new king as a savior. The revenge of the old order was systematic and ruthless. Akhenaten's beautiful city in the desert, Akhenaten, was methodically dismantled. Its temples were torn down, its palaces stripped, its stones repurposed for new construction projects. The city was abandoned to the sands, its very memory cursed. The names of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their immediate successors were chiseled from the king lists, the official chronicles of Egyptian history. It was an attempt at damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory, to make it as if the heretic pharaoh had never existed. Throughout the land, the priesthood of Amun was restored to its former glory, its lands and wealth returned, its temples reconsecrated. The quiet terror of this restoration was palpable. Any who had prospered under Akhenaten were now in mortal danger. It was a time of purges, secret denunciations, and political maneuvering, all happening in the shadow of a child's throne. Tutankhamun presided over this great undoing, but he was a king in name only. He spent his days performing the required rituals, indulging in his passion for hunting, and navigating the treacherous currents of his own court. The young pharaoh's life was short and poignant. Forensic analysis of his mummy reveals a host of health problems. He had a clubfoot, requiring him to walk with a cane, over 130 of which were found in his tomb. He also suffered from bone disease and multiple bouts of malaria, the most severe strain of which was likely the cause of his death around the age of 19. For many years it was believed he was murdered, a tantalizing theory fueled by a dark spot on the back of his skull. However, modern scans suggest this was likely damage caused during the mummification process. His death was probably the result of a weakened immune system, perhaps complicated by a broken leg that became infected. His end was not a dramatic assassination, but a sad, lonely fading away. A puppet ruler born in the midst of a religious war, who spent his brief life as a symbol of a restoration he did not create and died before he could ever truly rule. The loudest pharaohs are often forgotten by history, while the quietest boy can become immortal through a fluke of fate. Upon Tutankhamun's death, the vizier Ai, who may have been Nefertiti's father, seized the throne, even marrying Tutankhamun's young widow, Akhenaten, to legitimize his claim. But his reign was short. After him came the true architect of the post-Amarna world, General Horemheb. He took the throne and launched the final, most vicious phase of the persecution against the Amarna heretics. He passed laws to restore order and ruthlessly stamped out corruption, but his greatest legacy was the final erasure of his immediate predecessors. He had A's, and especially Tutankhamun's, name scraped from monuments, often inserting his own. In the official record, Horemheb's reign was said to have followed directly after that of Akhenaten's father, wiping the entire scandalous episode from history. This is why Tutankhamun was forgotten. Horemheb's persecution was so effective that the location of the boy king's tomb was lost to memory. It was this act of historical vengeance that inadvertently protected it. The tomb was so insignificant and forgotten that when workers built the tomb of a later Ramesside king above it, they piled the debris over its entrance, hiding it from the world for over 3,000 years. The quest to restore Egypt's glory was now complete, internally. The next step was to project that power outward once more, and for that, a new kind of pharaoh was needed. A warrior, a builder, but above all else, a master of propaganda. The pharaoh who would come to define this new era of restored glory was a force of nature. His name was Ramesses II, often called Ramesses the Great, and his reign of 66 years was one of the longest and most impactful in Egyptian history. He was a man of boundless energy, colossal ambition, and an ego to match. He was not just content to rule, he was determined to be the greatest pharaoh who had ever lived, and he would use every tool at his disposal, war, diplomacy, and above all, monumental construction, to carve that image into the very fabric of Egypt. His reign was the high watermark of the new kingdom, a golden age of power and prosperity. But it was also an age built on a carefully constructed image, a masterclass in the art of self-promotion. For Ramesses, a chisel was as mighty as a sword, for both carved his legend into eternity. He understood a fundamental truth about power. It is not enough to be strong, you must be seen as strong. The defining military event of his reign was the Battle of Kadesh, fought in modern-day Syria against the mighty Hittite Empire. It was one of the largest chariot battles ever fought, involving perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 chariots. Ramesses, young and eager to prove his military prowess, marched his army north. Through a combination of poor reconnaissance and Hittite deception, Ramesses was led into a trap. His vanguard was ambushed and shattered by a massive Hittite chariot charge. The Egyptian camp was overrun, and the pharaoh himself was surrounded, cut off from the main body of his army. By any objective measure, it was a military disaster born of his own recklessness. But it was in this moment of crisis that the legend of Ramesses the Great was born. According to his own account, which he had inscribed on temple walls all over Egypt, the young king, deserted by his troops, prayed to his father, the god Amun. The god heard him and filled him with supernatural strength. Single-handedly, Ramesses charged the Hittite line 6 times, cutting his way through the enemy, his divine power terrifying them into submission until reinforcements arrived to save the day. This account is, of course, almost entirely a work of fiction. In reality, the battle was a chaotic, bloody stalemate. Ramesses was lucky to escape with his life and a large part of his army. The Egyptians failed to take Kadesh, and the Hittites retained control of Syria. It was at best a draw, at worst a strategic defeat for Egypt. But that is not how Ramesses presented it. Upon his return to Egypt, he launched the most extensive propaganda campaign the ancient world had ever seen. The victory at Kadesh became his signature story. He had colossal reliefs carved on the walls of the temples at Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, and his own mortuary temple, the Ramesseum. The images are breathtaking in their scale and dynamism, showing the heroic pharaoh, alone in his chariot, towering over the diminutive, chaotic figures of his enemies. Accompanying the images was a long poetic text celebrating his personal valor. He turned a military blunder into his finest hour, a testament not to his strategic genius, but to his divine favor. The message was clear. Ramesses was no ordinary king. He was a living god whose power could turn the tide of battle by itself. His reign was also a period of unprecedented construction. He was a builder on a scale not seen since the Pyramid Age. He founded a new capital in the Nile Delta, Pi-Ramesses. He completed the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, a veritable forest of giant columns. He built his own massive mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, and countless other shrines and additions to existing temples. But his most audacious project was the pair of rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel in Nubia. The larger temple is fronted by 4 colossal, 20-meter-high statues of Ramesses himself, seated on his throne, staring into eternity. The temple's orientation is an engineering marvel. Twice a year, on the anniversaries of his birth and coronation, the rising sun's rays penetrate deep into the mountain sanctuary, illuminating the statues of the gods and of Ramesses himself. He had literally built a temple to his own divinity and commanded the sun to worship him. This was architecture as political theatre, a permanent and overwhelming statement of his power, designed to intimidate the rebellious Nubians and awe all who saw it. Ramesses was not just a warrior and a builder, he was also a shrewd diplomat. Years after the stalemate at Kadesh, with both empires exhausted by war and facing new threats, he negotiated the world's first surviving international peace treaty with the Hittite king. The text, preserved in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, calls for eternal peace and brotherhood between the two nations, a defensive alliance, and an extradition agreement for fugitives. To seal the deal, Ramesses later married a Hittite princess. This transformation from archenemy to trusted ally shows a pragmatic side to his rule. He understood that a stable peace was more beneficial to Egypt than endless, costly wars on a distant frontier. Yet even in peace, he continued to build his legend. He lived to an incredible age for the time, perhaps over 90 years old, and outlived many of his more than 100 children. By the end of his long reign, most Egyptians had known no other pharaoh. He seemed as permanent and eternal as the temples he had built. He had successfully created an image of himself as the ultimate pharaoh, the embodiment of Egyptian power and glory, an image so powerful that it has endured for over 3,000 years. But even the brightest golden age must eventually end, and a storm was gathering on the horizon, a storm from the sea that would threaten to extinguish the light of Egypt forever. The end of the Bronze Age in the late 13th and early 12th centuries before our era was a time of cataclysmic collapse. It was a domino effect of destruction that toppled empires and plunged the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Near East into a dark age. The great Hittite Empire, Ramesses' rival, vanished from history. The sophisticated Mycenaean palace civilization of Greece, the world of Agamemnon and Achilles, was burned to the ground. Major trading centers like Ugarit in Syria were utterly destroyed. The cause of this widespread collapse is still debated by historians. A perfect storm of climate change, drought, famine, systems collapse, and mass migrations. At the heart of this chaos was a mysterious confederation of displaced peoples, known from Egyptian records only by the enigmatic name the Sea Peoples. They were not a single nation, but a collection of different groups, perhaps including Proto-Sardinians, Sicilians, Etruscans, and Philistines, uprooted from their homes and on the move, a tidal wave of humanity that swept down from the Aegean and Anatolia with fire and sword. Egypt, old and rich, was their ultimate prize. The first major confrontation came during the reign of Merneptah, Ramesses the Great's son and successor. A coalition of Libyan tribes and their Sea Peoples allies invaded the western Nile delta, not just to raid, but to settle, bringing their families and cattle with them. Merneptah met them in a great battle and won a decisive victory, slaughtering thousands and driving the rest back into the desert. On his victory, Stela, he boasts of his triumph, famously including the first known extra-biblical reference to Israel. Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. For a moment it seemed Egypt had weathered the storm, but it was only a temporary reprieve. The wave had been turned back, but the tide was still rising. Egypt stood when the world fell, but in its victory it had begun to lose the world it once dominated. The empire in Asia was gone, trade routes were shattered, and the kingdom was now an isolated bastion in a sea of chaos. The final desperate showdown came during the reign of Ramesses III, the last great warrior pharaoh of the new kingdom. About 30 years after Merneptah's victory, a new, even larger wave of Sea Peoples descended. This time, they came from the north by both land and sea. Their armies marched down the coast of the Levant, destroying everything in their path, while their fleet sailed towards the mouths of the Nile. The inscriptions at Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu describe the terrifying advance. No land could stand before their arms. They laid their hands upon the lands as far as the circuit of the earth, their hearts confident and trusting, our plans will succeed. Ramesses III mounted a heroic, last-ditch defense. He fortified the coast, conscripted every available man, and met the invaders in a series of brutal battles. The land battle was a bloody affair, but the decisive confrontation took place in the Nile Delta, a chaotic naval engagement where Egyptian ships, more maneuverable in the narrow channels, grappled with the invaders' vessels. Reliefs at Medinet Habu show Egyptian archers raining arrows down on the enemy ships, while marines armed with spears and swords engage in vicious hand-to-hand combat. Ramesses won. He saved Egypt from the fate that had befallen the Hittites and Mycenaeans. It was a stunning victory, a moment of supreme glory. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. Egypt had survived, but it was mortally wounded. The wars had been ruinously expensive, emptying the state treasury. The kingdom was exhausted. The victory did not bring a new golden age, but rather the beginning of a long, slow decline. The reign of Ramesses III was beset by internal problems. Inflation spiraled out of control. Grain rations for the elite tomb builders at Deir el-Medina were delayed, leading to the first recorded labor strike in history. The workers laid down their tools and marched towards the temples, chanting, "We are hungry." It was a sign that the highly centralized state, once capable of building pyramids, could no longer even manage its payroll. The divine authority of the pharaoh was beginning to fray. And in the secret confines of the royal palace, a far more sinister plot was unfolding. The end of Ramesses III's life was not that of a triumphant hero, but that of a victim of betrayal. The so-called harem conspiracy was a plot hatched by one of his secondary wives, Ti, who wished to place her own son, Pentawere, on the throne instead of the designated heir. She colluded with high officials, military officers, and other women of the harem. They planned to assassinate the king during a festival. Judicial papyri that survive tell the story of the plot's discovery and the subsequent trial of the conspirators. The plotters were arrested and brought before a tribunal. Many were found guilty and sentenced to death or forced suicide. But what about the king? The papyri are coy about his fate, but a recent forensic examination of his mummy has provided a shocking answer. A deep cut, 7 centimeters long, was found across his throat, severing his trachea, esophagus, and major arteries. It was a wound that could not have been survived. The great hero who had saved Egypt from the Sea Peoples was murdered by his own family in his own palace. It was a squalid and tragic end, a symbol of the decay that was rotting the kingdom from within. The Golden Age was well and truly over. The invasion of the Sea Peoples was a turning point for the ancient world. Egypt survived, but at a terrible cost. It raises a difficult question about survival and identity. When faced with an existential threat, is it better to fight to the last, risking everything to preserve your way of life, even if victory leaves you broken? Or is it wiser to adapt, to bend and change in the face of the new reality, even if it means losing part of what you once were? Tell us in the comments what you believe is the truer form of strength. The death of Ramesses III marked the end of an era. The pharaohs who followed, a long line of Ramesseses, were pale imitations of their great predecessors. The unity of the kingdom fractured. For a time, Egypt was effectively split in two, with the high priests of Amun at Thebes ruling the south as a virtual theocracy, while the pharaohs controlled the north from the delta. This weakened and divided state became easy prey for a succession of foreign conquerors. First, it was the Libyans, descendants of the very people Ramesses III had defeated, who established their own dynasty of pharaohs. Then came the Nubians from the kingdom of Kush to the south, who saw themselves as the true heirs of Egyptian tradition and conquered the land to restore its former glory. After them came the ruthless Assyrians from Mesopotamia, who sacked Thebes, and then the mighty Persians, who incorporated Egypt into their vast empire. For centuries, the throne of the pharaohs was occupied by foreigners. The land of the pyramids had become a prize to be passed between empires. Then, in 332 BCE, a new conqueror arrived, a young, brilliant Macedonian king named Alexander the Great. He had already shattered the Persian Empire, and when he came to Egypt, he was not met as an invader, but as a liberator. In a masterstroke of political theatre, Alexander journeyed to the remote oasis of Siwa to consult the oracle of Amun. The priests, eager to legitimize his rule, declared him the son of the god. Alexander was crowned pharaoh in Memphis, adopting the traditional titles and roles of an Egyptian king. He was not just a conqueror, he was the legitimate successor to the ancient dynasties. He also left an indelible mark on the country by founding a new city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria. It was destined to become the greatest city of the Hellenistic world, a new capital, and a global center of trade, culture, and learning, housing the famous library and lighthouse. But Alexander's time in Egypt was brief. He soon departed to continue his conquests, never to return. After his death, his vast empire was carved up by his generals. The prize of Egypt fell to one of his cleverest and most cautious commanders, Ptolemy. Ptolemy and his descendants would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years. They were a Greek dynasty, speaking Greek and practicing Greek customs, but they were also pharaohs. They cleverly adopted the traditions of their new kingdom to legitimize their rule. They depicted themselves on temple walls in the classic pharaonic style, smiting enemies and making offerings to the Egyptian gods. They engaged in massive temple-building projects at places like Dendera and Edfu, creating some of the best-preserved monuments that survive today. But they also practiced incestuous marriage, brother marrying sister, a tradition that had ancient pharaonic roots but was also meant to keep the royal bloodline pure and power concentrated within the family. Alexandria was their capital, a Greek metropolis, but the heart of Egypt remained deeply pharaonic. It was a strange hybrid civilization, a fusion of two great cultures, but this dynasty, born from conquest, would be consumed by the ambitions of a new, rising power in the West, Rome. The last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty was one of the most famous women in history, Cleopatra VII. She was not the sultry seductress of legend, but a brilliant, highly educated and politically astute ruler. She was fluent in 9 languages, including Egyptian, the first of her dynasty to bother learning it, and was a shrewd strategist and diplomat. She inherited a kingdom that was a pawn in the increasingly brutal power struggles of the late Roman Republic. She knew that Egypt's only hope for survival was to ally itself with the winning side in Rome's civil wars. Her famous liaisons with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were not just romantic affairs, they were calculated political alliances. With Caesar, she secured her throne and produced a son, Caesarion, whom she hoped would one day rule a combined Roman-Egyptian empire. Cleopatra did not lose to Rome, she lost to a future that had no room for pharaohs. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra made her next great gamble, siding with his top general, Mark Antony, against Caesar's ambitious heir, Octavian. Their partnership was both a passionate love affair and a powerful political and military alliance. They ruled the eastern Mediterranean from Alexandria, dreaming of a new Hellenistic empire that could rival Rome. But Octavian was a master of propaganda, just like the pharaohs of old. He portrayed Antony as a decadent, un-Roman traitor, bewitched by a foreign queen. He painted Cleopatra as a dangerous, power-hungry seductress who sought to rule Rome. The final confrontation came at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC. The fleet of Antony and Cleopatra was decisively defeated. They fled back to Egypt with Octavian in pursuit. As his legions closed in on Alexandria, Antony committed suicide. Cleopatra, seeing that all was lost and unwilling to be paraded through the streets of Rome in Octavian's triumph, took her own life, famously, according to legend, by the bite of an asp. With her death, the last dynasty of the pharaohs came to an end. Her son Caesarion was hunted down and executed by Octavian, who coldly remarked, "2 Caesars are one too many." Egypt, the ancient kingdom of the gods, became a Roman province, the personal breadbasket of the new emperor, Augustus. 3,000 years of pharaonic rule were over. The eagles of Rome had finally vanquished the cobra of the Nile. The pharaohs were dead and entombed, but even in death they would not find peace. They would become the prey of a new kind of enemy, thieves of immortality. The idea that the tombs of the pharaohs lay undisturbed until the arrival of modern archaeologists is a romantic fiction. The truth is far more sordid. The systematic looting of the royal necropolises, particularly the Valley of the Kings, began almost as soon as the last corpse was sealed inside its tomb. It was a practice driven by greed, enabled by corruption, and sometimes even sanctioned by the state itself. The immense wealth buried with the kings, gold, silver, precious stones, and exquisite artifacts, was a temptation too great to resist in a country that was growing progressively poorer. The men who had built the tombs knew their secrets. They knew the layout of the passages, the locations of the hidden chambers, and the nature of the traps, which were mostly designed to deter casual thieves, not determined professionals. These were not smash-and-grab robberies. They were well-organized operations, often involving entire gangs, including stonecutters, carpenters, and metalsmiths. We have astonishing records of this criminal underworld in the form of judicial papyri from the late New Kingdom, which document the investigation and trial of captured tomb robbers. One famous papyrus details the interrogation of a man named Amenpenufa, a stonemason from the reign of Ramesses IX. He confesses under torture to breaking into the tomb of a 12th dynasty pharaoh. He describes in vivid detail how he and his gang tunneled through the rock, broke into the burial chamber, and found the king and queen in their sarcophagi. "We stripped off the gold that we found on the noble mummy of this god," he states matter-of-factly. "We found the noble mummy of this queen likewise. We took their amulets and the ornaments which were at their throats, and the coffins in which they were resting. We set fire to their coffins." The sacrilege is breathtaking. They were not just stealing treasure, they were destroying the pharaoh's chance at eternal life, violating the most sacred tenets of their own religion. The men who built tombs to cheat death were themselves being cheated by the living. This wave of looting was not just the work of desperate criminals, it was endemic and reached the highest levels of society. Local officials, mayors, and even priests were often in on the scheme, taking a cut of the profits and turning a blind eye. One particularly corrupt mayor of Western Thebes, a man named Pharaohs, was accused of being the mastermind behind a vast network of robbers. Despite overwhelming evidence presented by his rival, the mayor of Eastern Thebes, Pharaohs was acquitted in a sham trial, a clear sign that the justice system itself had become rotten. The state was no longer powerful enough to protect its own dead gods. As the central government weakened, the situation became a full-blown crisis. The Valley of the Kings, the glorious eternal resting place of the great New Kingdom pharaohs, had become a plundered, desecrated wasteland. Faced with this national shame, a small group of loyal priests during the chaotic 21st dynasty decided to take drastic action. They could no longer guard the dozens of individual tombs scattered throughout the valley. So they hatched a desperate and secret plan, a rescue mission. Under the cover of darkness, they entered the violated tombs of Egypt's greatest rulers. They found a scene of devastation. Coffins were smashed, mummies were torn apart by thieves searching for hidden jewels, and sacred objects lay scattered on the floor. The priests did what they could. They gathered the royal mummies, or what was left of them, including the bodies of legends like Ramesses the Great, Seti I, and Thutmose III. They rewrapped the desecrated bodies, placed them in simple replacement coffins, and added dockets identifying each king. Then they carried the bodies of their divine lords through the dark, silent necropolis, searching for a safe haven. This was not a funeral procession. It was a clandestine operation to hide the evidence of their own failure. Their solution was to create a cache, a secret communal grave where the kings could be hidden away from the world. They found two ideal locations. One was the tomb of a queen in Hapi, high in the cliffs of Deir el-Bahari. Here they stacked the coffins of over 40 kings, queens, and princes like firewood in a narrow chamber. Another group of mummies was hidden inside the tomb of Amenhotep II in the Valley of the Kings itself. For nearly 3,000 years, the greatest pharaohs in Egyptian history lay in these secret, unmarked graves, their names and deeds forgotten by the world above. The priests had saved the physical bodies of their kings, but in doing so they had confirmed that the age of pharaonic power was truly dead. The guardians of eternity had become undertakers, forced to hide their gods in the dark. These hidden caches would one day be stumbled upon not by priests or robbers, but by a new generation of explorers from foreign lands. Their discovery would ignite a global fascination with ancient Egypt, and the ghosts of the Nile would rise again to conquer the modern world. For centuries, Egypt was a sleepy, neglected province of the Ottoman Empire, its monumental past buried beneath the sand and the indifference of its rulers. The ghosts of the pharaohs slept soundly. Then, in 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt. He brought with him not just an army of soldiers, but also an army of 167 scholars, scientists, and artists. While Napoleon's military adventure was ultimately a failure, his scientific expedition was a spectacular success. These savants meticulously documented the ancient ruins, the flora and fauna, and the modern customs of Egypt. Their work was published in the monumental Description de l'Égypte, a multi-volume masterpiece that revealed the wonders of pharaonic civilization to an astonished Europe. It was the spark that lit the fire of modern Egyptology. Among the discoveries made by Napoleon's soldiers was a broken slab of black stone covered in 3 different scripts: hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek. This was the Rosetta Stone. It was the key, the code book, that would finally unlock the secrets of the ancient Egyptian language. The race to decipher the hieroglyphs became a fierce intellectual battle, primarily between the English polymath Thomas Young and the brilliant French linguist Jean-François Champollion. It was Champollion who, in 1822, finally cracked the code, realizing that the hieroglyphs were not just symbolic pictures, but a complex system of phonetic and ideographic signs. A silent civilization suddenly began to speak again, after a silence of nearly 2 millennia. The decipherment of the hieroglyphs unleashed a frenzy of Egyptomania across Europe and the United States of America. Everything Egyptian became fashionable. Furniture, jewelry, and architecture incorporated Egyptian motifs like obelisks, sphinxes, and lotus flowers. It was a cultural phenomenon, but it also had a dark side. This period was the Great Age of Plunder. European consuls and adventurers descended on Egypt using their political influence and wealth to amass huge collections of antiquities, often through methods that were little more than legalized looting. Entire temples were dismantled, colossal statues were dragged away, and thousands of mummies and artifacts were shipped off to fill the private collections and public museums of London, Paris, Berlin, and Turin. The most electrifying moment in this story of rediscovery came in 1922 with the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun by the English archaeologist Howard Carter, financed by Lord Carnarvon. After years of fruitless searching in the Valley of the Kings, Carter stumbled upon the top of a buried staircase. It led to a sealed doorway. As he made a small breach in the door and peered in with a candle, Carnarvon anxiously asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter's famous reply, "Yes, wonderful things." The tomb was small, but it was almost completely intact, packed to the ceiling with thousands of breathtaking treasures, golden chariots, jewel-encrusted thrones, and the iconic solid gold death mask of the boy king. The discovery created a worldwide media sensation. It was the first time the world had seen the undisturbed splendor of a pharaoh's burial. The curse of the pharaohs, a myth fanned by sensationalist newspapers after Lord Carnarvon died of an infected mosquito bite, only added to the global hysteria. Tutankhamun, a minor king erased from history by his own people, was resurrected as the most famous pharaoh of all time. The legacy of the pharaohs is not confined to museums and archaeological sites. The model of power they created has proven to be dangerously seductive, its echoes resonating through modern politics. The concept of a single charismatic leader embodying the will of the nation, the use of monumental architecture and mass rallies as propaganda to project an image of strength and permanence, the control of history and information to create an official narrative. These are all tactics pioneered on the banks of the Nile. From the imperial ambitions of Napoleon, who saw himself as a new Alexander, to the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, the shadow of the pharaoh has loomed large. The pharaohs proved that a combination of divine ideology, centralized bureaucracy, and military force could create a stable, long-lasting state of unprecedented scale. Their curse is not a magical hex, but the enduring appeal of this model of absolute power. Today, this legacy is a source of both immense national pride and fierce international debate for modern Egypt. The country is fighting to reclaim its stolen heritage. The Egyptian government has been actively campaigning for the repatriation of key artifacts, sparking heated controversies with Western museums. Should the Rosetta Stone be returned from the British Museum? Does the bust of Nefertiti belong in Berlin, where it was taken by a German archaeologist, or in Cairo? These are not just arguments about museum exhibits. They are profound questions about cultural ownership, colonial legacies, and national identity. The artifacts of the pharaohs have become potent symbols in a modern geopolitical landscape. The pharaohs themselves may be long dead, their bodies lying in climate-controlled museum cases, but their ideas about power, divinity, eternity, and control are more alive than ever. They built a civilization that has captivated the world for millennia, but they built it on a foundation of unquestioning obedience and absolute authority. Their story is a timeless reminder of the grandeur and the terror that human beings are capable of when they believe they are acting on behalf of the gods. The pharaohs created a model of power that was admired and copied for millennia. They proved that the will of one person, backed by faith and force, can move mountains and nations. Today, as the world once again grapples with questions of leadership and authority, their legacy is more relevant than ever. So tell me, what do you see in them primarily? Brilliant builders of civilization whose monumental achievements are an inspiration, or ruthless tyrants whose model of absolute control is a dangerous warning? Write your answer in the comments, because this choice helps define not just our past, but our future.